Good show.
Who cares what I think?
Moonjumper here. Who cares what I think? Sub-episode 19-02. This will be an excerpt from Part 2 of Star Trek Discovery vs. Picard, subtitled Star Trek Generations, a broad brush look at how different generations of Star Trek fans view the various incarnations of the franchise over the many decades. None of this being absolute. None of this is a judgment. Everyone's an individual, but I can certainly observe certain patterns when I've been watching Star Trek all of my 50 years and interacting with fellow fans of all generations for so many decades. You pick up on things, and I certainly know my own biases. I certainly have them. In this clip I'm about to play, I was discussing why I, as an old school TOS fan and DS9 fan, personally prefer Star Trek Picard to Star Trek Discovery. I can barely stomach Discovery. It pretty well ruined my childhood with its bulldozing of the TOS era canon, but I actually kind of liked Picard, or at least preferred it to Discovery by a considerable margin. It still got quite a few issues with some glaring plot holes and a terrible season 1 finale, but at least you recognize the universe, albeit it's a much darker Star Trek universe than many TNG fans are accustomed to. Now, DS9 fans who have a lot of crossover with TOS fans, we don't mind the darkness. We're used to it. But your pure TNG fans, their childhood memories are those of Jean-Luc Picard, the wise, no-nonsense captain of the Enterprise D, the flagship of the Federation utopia. This ain't that. This is about an embittered old man well past his prime who has become disillusioned by the very Federation he once idealized, perhaps overly so. While I find that intriguing, I can understand why some may not. But at least when it comes to respecting canon or lack thereof, love it or hate it, Picard is not Discovery. Not by a long shot. Roll the tape. Therefore, what we see in Discovery is at best anachronistic if one insists that Discovery is a direct prequel set in the same timeline as the original series. Both may be technically canon, but the continuity is dissonant to say the least. But let's say we do ignore the visuals, we ignore Trials and Tribble-ations, and In a Mirror Darkly. Discovery is just a visual reboot that hasn't otherwise changed the story continuity, has it? Yes it has, dramatically. Not just TOS, but for the entire franchise. I've already covered a lot of this in previous videos, so I won't get bogged down here. Here's just a few examples up on the screen. You can hit pause and read them. Suffice to say, the major events, I'm talking about the story, not what shape the struts are on the Enterprise. The major events which take place in the first 2 seasons of Star Trek Discovery cannot be explained away or shrugged off because young junior officer Spock says, "Everybody, just don't say anything. We'll all keep quiet about it. It's classified. Harry Mudd, I trust you won't say anything about that spore drive." We can trust Harry Mudd not to act on that information. Klingons aren't going to say or do anything with that information. All the millions of people who watch Michael Burnham and her crewmates have medals pinned to their chest on live galactic television. Nah, they never existed. And if you ever mention their names, family members, our Gestapo will arrest you and charge you with treason because the Federation is apparently fascist now? I'm sorry, as a TOS aficionado, not to mention Discovery's discontinuity with the rest of the franchise, TNG DS9 Voyager included, that just doesn't work for me. It does not line up at all if Discovery is truly set in the same continuity, the same timeline. It simply cannot be reconciled. The only way to explain it would be some kind of timey-wimey something like the Temporal Cold War, which actually does get mentioned in Season 3 to their credit. Otherwise, it simply cannot be the same timeline. It just can't. Now, Now, Star Trek Picard, by the way, season 2 dropping any day now, that's not so much of an issue. Love it or hate it, it's set some 20 years after Nemesis, 20 plus years after Voyager. Whatever happens, good writing or terrible writing, it does not change anything that happened before, and for that reason alone, I like it 100 times better than Discovery, which seemed hell-bent on essentially decanonizing the original series, and for that matter, not paying much heed to any of the spin-offs other than, a couple of ham-fisted nods to Enterprise, none of which seem to be the results of them actually watching Enterprise. I mean, you get the impression that if it's not on Memory Alpha, they don't know about it, and if it is on Memory Alpha, they have no clue as to the context or whether or not it's even appropriate to the time period. That's the people running Discovery. Star Trek Picard, on the other hand, which was headed up by Michael Chabon in its first season, actually does a better job in this regard, at least in the first season. You may not like the story he tells, and there's definitely some clumsiness with the logic of the plot, but you get the sense that he has at least watched Star Trek. Narratively speaking, Picard is a continuation of Star Trek The Next Generation, and also Voyager with 7 of 9 being part of the main cast. But tonally, it has more in common with, say, Deep Space Nine. It's certainly not DS9 in terms of quality, which I consider the great pinnacle of the franchise, not TNG. But that's the old school Trekkie in me. I was always lukewarm when it came to The Next Generation, but Deep Space Nine for me was brilliant, and a far truer spiritual successor to the original series than TNG ever was, even though it was set on a stationary space station instead of the Enterprise. Sisko had a lot more in common with Kirk than he ever did with Picard.
You hit me. Picard never hit me. I'm not Picard. Indeed not.
Likewise, Star Trek Picard has more in common with DS9 than it does with TNG, tonally speaking. People tend to think of TNG as the zeitgeist, the defining characterization of what Star Trek is, what the Federation is and represents. And the truth is, it's kind of the outlier. It's one series, a moment in time out of the entire franchise, and largely out of character from the Space Western original series, which spawned not only TNG, but the entire Star Trek universe, which is pretty tonally diverse. The rough and tumble atmosphere of Star Trek Picard feels a lot more like the rough and tumble atmospheres of DS9, of the original series, than the also civilized utopian atmosphere of TNG, which is why I, as a TOS and DS9 fan, probably enjoyed Picard far more than a lot of TNG fans did. TNG fans mostly hated Picard. They disliked Discovery, but they hated Picard. I didn't mind Picard so much, while I despised the first 2 seasons of Discovery, and a lot of my TOS buddies have said the same thing. But I think that's due to a bit of that proverbial generation gap between older TOS fans and slightly younger TNG fans. But what we do share in common is we don't want our childhood toys crapped on. Discovery crapped all over the era of the original series, gleefully. No doubt in my mind it was on purpose with middle finger extended. And to a degree, Picard does kind of crap all over the mood of the Next Generation, if viewed through a TNG only lens, but not necessarily, not as egregiously in my opinion, if viewed through the wider lens of the expanded TNG universe, that being the darker tones of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and even the TNG movies, First Contact, Insurrection, Nemesis, and everything that could be imagined post-Nemesis. It's all a much darker era than the relative innocence of early TNG, pre-Borg, pre-Dominion War, pre-breakup and ultimately destruction of the Romulan Empire. Read some of the non-canon novels, emphasis on non-canon, but they do speak to the dark, bleak despair of a Federation on the brink of collapse, and similar beats come up in STO. These stories, albeit non-canon, do inform the bleakness we see in Picard at the dawn of the 25th century, a Federation that has been so beaten down it has lost much of its idealism, much of its a little too comfortable naivete. That's not unrealistic. On the other hand, while the mood of Picard may be realistic given everything that's happened, a lot of its plot is completely bonkers, illogical, and the exact opposite of realistic. And I will also concede that while I didn't mind the mood of the series, I did think that the character of Jean-Luc Picard was a little too out of character. As a Kirk-era fan, I've always considered Picard something of a pompous ass. I'm sorry, I just do. To me, he's like the proverbial limousine liberal who deserved being called out on his hypocrisy by Lily in First Contact.
In my century, we don't succumb to revenge. We have a more evolved sensibility.
Bullshit!
By Raffi in Picard, and previously even Q and Guinan to a certain degree back in TNG.
Oh no, I know Hamlet. And what he might say with irony, I say with conviction. What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. Surely you don't see your species like that, do you?
These were much needed wake-up calls which did inspire some character growth. Nonetheless, despite any past personal failings of self-reflection, like Picard looking down his nose at some alien or someone from Earth's past, we humans in the 24th century have evolved past material wants, except he's got plenty of material possessions of his own. You don't see him giving up too many creature comforts.
I saw you sitting back in your very fine chateau, big oak beams, heirloom furniture. Yeah, I'd show you around my estate, but it's more of a hovel, so that would just be, humiliating.
Almost the stereotypical limousine liberal. I cheered Raffi calling him out on that. Nonetheless, he was always a great captain. You can be a pompous ass, you can be a jerk, but still be a great leader. I'm happy to see him become less of an asshole. We did see that kind of character growth happening in TNG's later seasons.
I should have done this a long time ago.
You were always welcome.
He did become much less insufferable, but he was still the great leader he had always been. I still wanted to see him be that great leader, whereas in Picard, he is very much a shadow of his former self, lacking that confident gravitas that inspires confidence in others. And that has nothing to do with age. I'm talking strictly demeanor, and that is frustrating. In that regard, I do empathize with my TNG brothers and sisters. And stop the tape. Thank you for hearing me out on this, and know whichever Star Trek generation you're a member, my arms are open to you.
Timber, his arms wide.
I'll go along with that.
And I hope you have time to watch the full 36-minute episode, Who Cares What I Think, Episode 19, Star Trek Generations, pun intended. Link down below, and if you're on YouTube, at the end of this episode. Or if you're watching this on a different platform, spoiler alert, it'll be linked down below. From deep in the heart of Texas, I am Moonjumper.
Who cares what I think?